that I'm mindful that the subject of slavery is a painful one for so many of us, as is the history of the United States government and US citizens' aggression, and often very violent and deadly aggression towards Native peoples, even in our own region here. Nonetheless, it's an important history that deserves our careful and our thoughtful attention. So I'd just like to say that at the beginning, in part because the other thing that happens, how many of you are graduate students? All right, oh, good, so the chunk of you, right? So one of the things that happens, as you know, right, when you're in graduate school and you spend all this time in the library with your books and your documents, right? And you're so immersed in this material. And there's a moment where it's all, in a bizarre way, seems very normal to us, right? That if you're working on projects that are about slavery or about colonial domination, right? Like, this is what you surround yourself with every day, and it seems normal. And, you know, for me, I always then have to take that step back and think, wait, right, these are people's lives, right? Like, people are struggling day after day. And so to be mindful, right, that we're talking about people's emotional lives, people's physical lives, people's spiritual lives, as we do our work of scholarship. So just to give you a sense geographically where I will be talking about, and so I'm doing this old school with no PowerPoint, so you have to pay attention. Geographically, the region that I'm going to talk about briefly is the region that we think of today as the Deep South, right? Or in the antebellum term, cotton country, right? So mainly Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, and Florida. This vast expanse, millions and millions of acres, once home to and once ruled by Seminoles, Cherokees, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and many other Native peoples. The history of slavery in these southern Native nations, you'll see some scholars refer to these Native nations as southeastern, and I deliberately choose the term southern. The history of slavery in these southern Native nations necessarily changes what we know and what we assume about the South, about slavery, and the meanings of race and citizenship in American history. Chattel slavery emerged, so Elena gave me a specific set of questions to address for you. And so the first one was, and this is a question, so how many people are working on slavery and or Native American related projects? A couple of you. Oh, a fair number of you, okay. So one question that you will encounter if you have not already encountered, right, is, I didn't know Native Americans owned slaves. Chattel slavery emerged in the southern Native nations over time, right? It was not sort of an immediate event that just happened. But certainly by the early years of the 19th century, the institution of human bondage, particularly accompanied by a bedrock ideology of racial hierarchy, gradually took shape in southern Native communities. And chattel slavery in the southern Native communities dates back really to the early 17th century, right? To earlier practices of Native American captivity, subordination, and unfreedom. And obviously you have here at your university, the professor who's written sort of the book on the history of Native captive taking and unfreedom, Professor Christina Snyder. Beginning in the late 17th century, generations of Southern Indian women and men, however, became well acquainted with the dynamics of European colonial slave societies, right? Those colonial societies springing up throughout the Deep South and the Eastern Seaboard in the 1700s, in the 18th century. But I think it would be a mistake for us to draw a clear line or a clear trajectory from Native captivity to Native practices of chattel slavery, right? That is what I try to argue in my own work, is that the practice of chattel slavery really marked a break from older indigenous traditions of subordination, of captivity and unfreedom. And while certainly there are resonances of those older Native traditions, the practice of chattel slavery and of racial chattel slavery in particular required the adoption and institutionalization of a particular set of ideologies and practices around issues of race, gender, and labor. some of which I will get to very briefly. But just to give you the brief overview, and through the colonial period, through the 18th century, colonial traders, British, French, and Spanish, made alliances, military alliances and trade alliances with Southern Native peoples, right? And so there's this moment when Southern Native peoples are important intermediaries in colonial rivalries for territorial and trade domination in the what becomes the Southern United States. And one of the things that colonial traders pressed Native warriors, Native men in particular, to do was to raid enemy settlements and take captives, primarily men, captives of war, and rather than hold them in the victor society as their own subordinates, sell them to colonial traders as slaves. And so, in fact, I think one of the most important points, if we think about a long history of the United States, is that there's this period through the 18th century where there are more Native Americans enslaved than Africans, right? There are more Native Americans exported from North America to the West Indian colonies than there are African slaves imported to the North American colonies. And this shifts about 2/3 of the way through the 18th century. But there's this period of time where Native Americans are regarded as chattel slaves. And Native Americans, and somehow this doesn't seem to be as inflammatory as when people insist that African peoples were involved in the African slave trade, but Native peoples are involved in capturing and selling and bartering Native captives as slaves. Traditionally, male captives had been put to death after a period of ritualized torture, and women and children were incorporated into their host society to bolster populations that had been reduced by war. These meanings of captivity and the practices of captivity shift as a result of colonial intrusions, and here's where Professor Snyder's work plays such an important role in helping us understand those shifts, right? What shifts is that as colonial traders start to purchase captives, there's a new market for these captives, right? And so increasingly captives are sold to Europeans rather than being retained by the host society. Older scholarship contended and argued for us that Native peoples were really hapless pawns in these colonial ventures, right? In these colonial slave trading ventures, and especially in colonial efforts to keep Africans and Native peoples separate. One of the things we know that I'm not going to talk about tonight, unless you have specific questions about it, is that there are countless instances of Native Americans and Africans and their American-born descendants forging strategic alliances with each other, right? Creating maroon communities, hiding out. I mean, I've written in other places about Creek Indians welcoming and incorporating runaway slave women into their communities, right, and protecting them from re-enslavement by white slaveholders in the Deep South. And for a long time, the scholarship told us that in an effort to prevent that, colonial authorities, colonial traders deployed Native Americans as slave catchers, right, to police the boundaries of these emerging plantation societies in the southern colonies. And while that's true, it is also true that Native Americans participated in that kind of policing, right, of capturing fugitive African slaves, returning them, participated in that policing deliberately, right? It was not unknowingly that they engaged in these behaviors, right? But these were deliberate decisions that Native leaders and Native individuals, primarily men, engaged in for a number of reasons, partially to secure their alliances with colonial settlements and colonial authorities, partially, right, to gain a strategic advantage in those alliances, right? So while they were certainly under pressure from colonial authorities, they were never without the decision-making skills that inform much of human history. And increasingly, through the 18th century, Native peoples in the southern colonies came to appreciate very keenly the strategic and the economic value associated with those commodified black bodies, right, with those commodified Africans and their American-born descendants. And what I mean by the strategic value of that is for Native warriors who raided other settlements, whether they were Native settlements or European settlements, and took African peoples, people of African descent, as captives, those Native warriors understood very well the strategic leverage that possessing these captives gave them, right? That they could demand higher and higher ransoms from European colonial settlers and authorities who sought to regain possession of their slave property, right? So there was a strategic element associated with this policing and raiding behavior as well. This all changes after the American Revolution. After the American Revolution, federal policymakers are increasingly not inclined to view Southern Native peoples as potential military allies or as potential and valuable trading partners. Certainly there's much trade that continues post-revolution, but the strategic importance of that trade is significantly lessened to the federal government. And increasingly, as Adam Rothman has written about in his book, Slave Country, federal lawmakers, federal policymakers are increasingly inclined to regard the Deep South and the lower Mississippi Valley, again, sort of Mississippi, Georgia, Alabama, Louisiana, as territory that needs to be brought firmly and squarely under the control of the federal government and of local state governments. And so starting in 1785, Henry Knox, under the George Washington administration, pursues what he calls a peace policy. Right? That is, pursues this policy that contends that it is more effective and certainly cheaper for a nation just coming out of a war to pursue peaceful negotiations with Southern Native peoples rather than make war against them. Right? The goal of Knox's peace policy is the civilization component in my title. Right? Knox's peace policy contends that the federal government should enter trade relations with Southern Native peoples with the goal primarily of fostering debt among individuals and then collecting on that debt through the nation. But by fostering debt through Indian individuals and then demanding land cessions from the collective, from the nation, as payment for it was one part of the peace policy. Other elements of the peace policy involved dispatching missionaries and other social reformers, if you will, white missionaries, to Southern Native nations with the goal explicitly of converting them to Christianity. And beyond that, really, you know, they use nice euphemistic language like training, teaching, educating, enlightening, but it's really imposing, forcing, and demanding significant changes in Native peoples' gender roles,